Xavier Shaw, a successful black entrepreneur, returns to his small hometown, hoping to bring positive change, but is met with hostility and blatant racism. Sheriff Daniels, a corrupt and bigoted officer, targets Xavier relentlessly, using his position to harass, humiliate, and undermine him. Through microaggressions, abuse of power, and false accusations, the sheriff's actions reveal the deep-rooted racism that thrives within the town system. As tensions escalate, Xavier's every move is scrutinized, forcing him to confront the injustices head-on while exposing the disturbing truths about prejudice and corruption in America. Darius King stepped off the plane, the crisp winter air hitting him like a wall. He paused at the jet bridge, exhaling deeply, his breath visible in the cold. The small town of Havenfield had never been on his radar, but for the next few weeks, it would be his entire world. Darius adjusted his wool coat, running a hand over the fabric to smooth it. The coat, like everything else he wore, was understated but high quality. Dark navy, clean lines, and just enough weight to ward off the biting chill. He had built his life on this balance. Success without the flash, confidence without arrogance. Darius King was a self-made millionaire and founder of one of the most successful construction and development firms on the East Coast. The man could turn empty lots into thriving communities, abandoned buildings into state-of-the-art facilities. People respected him for his work, but that didn't mean they always saw him. That was something Havenfield would learn soon enough. At the baggage claim, Darius waited quietly as the carousel groaned to life, his leather duffel circling toward him. He ignored the curious glances from other passengers as they whispered among themselves. Havenfield was small, far from the bustling cities where Darius spent most of his time. Out here, faces that didn't match the town's homogeneity stood out. As Darius wheeled his bag toward the exit, a voice called out, "Mr. King?" Darius turned to find a man holding a sign with his name on it. The driver was a wiry man in his mid-50s, wearing a navy cap and a forced smile. Darius offered his hand politely. "Darius King." "Ah, nice to meet you, sir," the man replied, gripping Darius's hand briefly before dropping it. He seemed surprised by the firmness of the handshake. "I'm Walter, I'll take you to the Havenfield Hotel." Darius gave a small nod. "Thank you." The drive into town was quiet, broken only by the occasional comment from Walter about the local landmarks. "That's the old mill, been shut down for years." Or the weather. "Cold snap this early. You don't see that often." But Darius's attention was elsewhere. He stared out the window, taking in the rows of quiet streets, the faded storefronts, the cracked pavement where weeds pushed through Havenfield. Wasn't just small, it felt forgotten. When Walter pulled up to the Havenfield Hotel, Darius raised an eyebrow at the sight. The building was an echo of its former self. Grand once, perhaps decades ago, but now it was a tired shadow of its past. The sign flickered with weak neon, and the front awning sagged at one corner. "You'll be staying here for the next few weeks, right?" Walter asked, as he grabbed Darius's bag from the trunk. "That's right," Darius replied smoothly, stepping onto the uneven pavement. "I'm here for work." Walter paused, curiosity flashing across his face. "What kind of work brings someone like you out to a place like this?" Darius smiled faintly, the question too familiar. "I'm evaluating a few projects." It wasn't a lie. Havenfield was in the process of approving development proposals for a major infrastructure project, one that Darius had invested significant resources into. On paper, he was here to oversee the proposals and meet with the local council to ensure everything was on track. In reality, he was here to observe. Over the past few months, Darius's team had flagged alarming reports of irregularities with the project's management discrepancies in the bidding process, under-the-table deals that cut corners, and questionable treatment of contractors, especially those who didn't fit the status quo. As an outsider, Darius knew walking into this town with his title on display would only shut doors. So he had chosen a different path. Inside the hotel, the lobby buzzed faintly with the hum of an old heater, the warmth barely pushing back the chill. The receptionist, a young woman with tired eyes, glanced up as Darius approached. Her gaze flickered over his appearance, landing on the duffel bag at his side. "Checking in?" she asked, her tone polite but indifferent. "Yes, Darius King." She clicked away on the ancient computer before frowning slightly. "I don't see your reservation, sir." Darius's expression didn't falter. "It was booked a week ago." Her fingers clacked on the keyboard again, and this time she avoided meeting his eyes. "There's nothing here under that name." "Check again," Darius said calmly. "Sir, I'm sure it's not here." Her voice grew sharper, though she kept a tight smile. "Maybe there's been a mix-up with—" "I have the confirmation right here," Darius interrupted, pulling his phone from his pocket. He held the screen up, the email glowing clearly. The woman hesitated, her cheeks flushing slightly, and Darius could see her debating whether to push further. Before she could speak, a man in a tan blazer appeared behind the desk. His presence immediately changed the air. Tall, with graying hair and a practiced smile, he carried himself like someone used to being in charge. "Is there a problem here?" he asked. The receptionist shifted awkwardly. "Mr. King says he has a reservation, but I don't see it." Darius remained calm. "There's no problem. Just a misunderstanding." The man eyed Darius for a long moment, before his smile grew tighter. "I'm the hotel manager. I'm afraid we're fully booked tonight. Even if there was a reservation, it's likely been cancelled or misplaced." "Fully booked?" Darius glanced around the nearly empty lobby. "Is there an event happening?" The manager bristled slightly. "That's not your concern. Unfortunately, we can't accommodate you." The words were said with finality, and Darius recognized the message between the lines. "I see," Darius replied softly, his voice betraying nothing. "Thank you for your time." Without another word, he turned and walked back toward the front doors, feeling the manager's gaze lingering on him. Outside, the cold wind bit at his face, but it did nothing to cool the simmering resolve in his chest. "They think I don't belong here." Darius King had faced worse in his life. People who underestimated him, who judged him before they knew a thing about him. This was no different. He reached for his phone, dialing the first number in his favorites. The call connected almost immediately. "David," Darius said, his tone calm but firm. "We've got a situation in Havenfield. I need a backup plan, fast." As he hung up, he glanced back at the flickering hotel sign, his jaw tightening. They had no idea who they were turning away. The whistle of the old train faded into the distance as Andre Holland stepped off the platform and onto the cracked pavement of Millwood Station. He adjusted the cuff of his dark wool coat, its timeless simplicity starkly contrasting with the faded paint and rusting beams surrounding him. A sharp wind bit through the air, carrying the scent of oil and dust. Andre took a deep breath, letting the small-town silence settle around him. It was a quiet unlike the city, unnervingly still, as if it held its breath whenever someone unfamiliar stepped into its world. Millwood was a place forgotten by time, the kind of town where history lingered, not as a legacy, but as a weight. The buildings were old, but not quaint, the streets empty, but not serene. Andre took it in, his eyes flickering over the peeling signs, the boarded-up shops, the rusty old cars rolling by as if apologizing for their noise. A young boy sitting on a bench stared at him, wide-eyed, uncertain. Andre offered a small smile, but the boy quickly looked away, his sneakers scraping nervously against the ground. Andre was used to it. At 6'3", broad-shouldered, with a calm but commanding presence, Andre stood out in Millwood. His deep brown skin didn't help matters here, where faces like his weren't common, and those that were often got glances, filled with more suspicion than curiosity. He'd faced this look his entire life, expecting less of him without ever knowing who he really was, no matter he hadn't come here for validation. Andre adjusted the leather strap of his briefcase and started walking. His pace was measured, unrushed, as if he had all the time in the world. And in some ways, he did. Andre Holland had built his life carefully, brick by brick, until it stood as something unshakable. A Harvard-educated lawyer, he now led one of the nation's most respected firms, specializing in civil rights and justice reform. His name appeared in magazines, his face on news panels during landmark cases. Yet, as he walked down Millwood's forgotten Main Street, his success felt as distant as the city skyline. Andre didn't mind. He liked to walk quietly among people, to see how life existed when titles were stripped away. He turned a corner, spotting his destination. Millwood Diner. Its red and white sign hung crooked over a narrow doorway, the neon letters buzzing faintly like an aging whisper. He'd chosen this place deliberately, ordinary, unremarkable. There was power in the mundane, where people said things they wouldn't say elsewhere, where truth slipped out like breath. Andre pushed open the door, a bell above him jingling as he stepped inside. The air smelled of stale coffee and fried grease, mingling with the sharp tang of old linoleum and disinfectant. A dozen heads turned his way, instinctively drawn to the sound of the door, and then lingered just a second too long when they saw him. The diner was small. Booths lined one wall, with cracked vinyl seats and formica tables, and a counter lined with round stools in faded red. The hum of conversation had already quieted, the low murmur replaced by that strange hush that happened when someone didn't belong. Andre ignored it. A waitress in her late 40s approached from behind the counter, holding a damp rag that she wiped absently along her apron. Her smile was thin and tight, her eyes wary. "Can I help you?" Andre offered a polite nod. "I'll take a coffee black." Her gaze lingered on him, taking in his well-cut coat, the shine of his shoes, and the leather briefcase. She gave a curt nod. "Take a seat anywhere." Andre chose the booth in the far corner, near the window where the late afternoon light streamed in. He settled in with the ease of a man accustomed to watching a room, without being watched himself. Years in courtrooms had taught him how to command attention, but it had also taught him how to blend into the background when necessary. He unbuckled his briefcase and pulled out a leather notebook, flipping it open to a blank page. Outside the window, Millwood crawled through its day, its pace as slow as the cars rumbling over uneven streets. The waitress returned a few minutes later with a steaming cup of coffee. She set it down a little harder than necessary, causing the liquid to slosh dangerously near the edge. "Here you go. Anything else?" Andre shook his head. "This is fine, thank you." Her expression softened just a little at his calm, polite tone. "All right then." She moved away without another word. Andre stirred his coffee, letting the silence settle. The low hum of conversation resumed, though he could still feel eyes darting toward him. Two men sitting at the counter glanced back more than once, exchanging low words Andre couldn't hear. Another man, sitting at a booth near the door, seemed to size him up every time Andre looked down to jot something in his notebook. Andre knew what they were thinking. He knew it from the tight way they held their shoulders, the dart of their eyes, the barely concealed discomfort. Who is he? Why is he here? These were questions they wouldn't ask out loud. Andre sipped his coffee, unbothered. Millwood might have been unfamiliar with him, but he wasn't unfamiliar with Millwood. He'd seen places like this time and again, towns where the faces changed, but the rules stayed the same. Outsiders were tolerated, but never welcomed, especially when they didn't fit the mold. The bell above the door jingled again, and a gust of cold air swept in. Andre didn't look up right away, but he heard the heavy boots step inside, the confident gait as someone approached the counter. "Coffee, Sue," came the gruff voice. Andre glanced up, his gaze catching on the figure that had entered. It was a man in his mid-50s, tall and broad, with a square jaw and piercing blue eyes that seemed to cut through the room. He wore a sheriff's badge on his belt, the metal catching a flash of light. The man's name, Sheriff Walter Grady, was stitched onto his uniform. The sheriff accepted his cup of coffee and turned, his gaze landing squarely on Andre. Andre felt it. A moment of unspoken tension, like a drawn breath that didn't release. Walter's eyes narrowed slightly, and his mouth set into a firm line. He didn't smile. Instead, he turned back to the counter, muttering something under his breath to the waitress. Sue shot a glance toward Andre, before replying with a shrug. Andre made a note in his notebook, his pen scratching quietly against the page. He knew this was the beginning. He was here to meet with Millwood's counsel about the construction project his firm had been contracted for, a state-of-the-art youth center designed to bring jobs and infrastructure to the struggling town. It was supposed to be a win for everyone, but something had stalled it at the final approval stage. Permits had disappeared, meetings were canceled, and phone calls went unreturned. When Andre had started digging, the answers grew murky, like shadows behind frosted glass. Now, sitting in the corner of Millwood Diner, he could feel the resistance in the room. Not overt, not yet, but simmering beneath the surface like an ember waiting for a gust of wind. Sheriff Grady finished his coffee and pushed away from the counter, his boots echoing against the tile floor as he approached the door. Before leaving, he paused just long enough to glance back at Andre, his gaze cold and unwavering. "Welcome to Millwood," the sheriff said, his voice clipped. Then he was gone, the bell above the door ringing in his wake. Andre leaned back, watching the sheriff disappear down the street. He took another sip of his coffee, his calm expression betraying nothing. The game has begun. Andre Holland wasn't easily rattled. Years of courtroom battles and boardroom negotiations had forged his patience into steel. But Millwood had a way of testing even the most tempered resolve. The diner slowly settled back into its quiet rhythm after Sheriff Grady's exit, though the subtle tension lingered like smoke that refused to clear. Andre felt eyes still flickering in his direction, whispers too faint to reach his ears, but their tone was unmistakable. He finished his coffee, his movements precise and unhurried, before placing a crisp $5 bill under the chipped saucer. As he slid the leather notebook back into his briefcase, the faint squeak of approaching footsteps caught his attention. "Sir?" Andre looked up to find Sue, the waitress, standing by his table. She held the coffee pot against her hip, her fingers gripping the handle a little too tightly. "Yes?" Sue hesitated. "Look, I don't mean any offense, but folks around here ain't used to people like you just showing up, especially in places like this." Andre regarded her calmly, the flicker of a smile softening his otherwise impassive face. "People like me?" Her cheeks reddened. "You know what I mean." "I'd prefer you said it out loud." His voice was calm, steady, but there was no mistaking the edge beneath it. Sue shifted on her feet, glancing toward the counter where the two men from earlier were watching with idle interest. "I'm just saying. You might want to be careful. Sheriff Grady doesn't take kindly to strangers stirring things up, especially—" Andre arched an eyebrow. "Especially what?" Sue swallowed hard, her gaze dropping. "Especially outsiders who don't know their place." The words hung heavy in the air. Andre let them linger for a beat, before offering her a small, polite nod. "Thank you for the advice." He stood smoothly, his tall frame forcing Sue to step back slightly. Her eyes widened at the unintended intimidation, and Andre sighed quietly to himself. "I appreciate the coffee," he said gently, before heading toward the door. Outside, the cold air bit at him again, sharp and bracing. He slipped his hands into his coat pockets and began walking toward Millwood's courthouse, his next stop. The courthouse was a squat, gray building, built more for function than form, and surrounded by patchy grass that hadn't seen rain in weeks. A brass plaque mounted to the brick wall read, "Millwood Municipal Hall," the letters weathered and tarnished. Inside, Andre found himself in a narrow hallway with scuffed floors and fluorescent lights buzzing overhead. The front desk was manned by a wiry man with thinning hair and thick glasses perched on his nose. His name tag read, J. Perkins. "Good afternoon," Andre said as he approached. "I have a meeting scheduled with the council regarding the youth center permit applications, Andre Holland." Perkins squinted at him, as though processing Andre's words required significant effort. His gaze flickered briefly over Andre's coat, the polished leather briefcase, then back up to his face. The man's lips tightened into a faint frown. "Uh-huh," Perkins muttered, rifling through a stack of papers on his desk. "Let me check. You're sure you're supposed to be here?" "I'm quite sure." Andre kept his tone level. Perkins glanced up again, his expression a blend of suspicion and mild disbelief. "You're with the city or—" Andre exhaled slowly. "I'm the legal representative overseeing the project. We submitted all required paperwork to your office last month." "Oh," Perkins muttered, as though this were news to him. He dug through a battered folder until he found a paper with Andre's name on it. His frown deepened as he skimmed it, eyes narrowing. "Right, just have a seat. The council's in session now. I'll let them know you're here." Andre nodded, stepping toward the row of chairs lining the wall. He sat down and crossed his legs, pulling out his notebook again, while Perkins disappeared down a hallway. Several minutes passed. Then 10:15. Andre glanced at his watch, noting the time with a calm patience that only thinly veiled his irritation. He'd sat in enough small-town buildings to know the game. Keep the outsider waiting, see if he'd grow uncomfortable or impatient enough to leave. A door opened abruptly, and a heavy-set man in a plaid jacket appeared. He was flanked by two others, both older, with the same weathered look etched into their faces. The man's eyes immediately locked onto Andre, narrowing with barely concealed skepticism. "Mr. Holland?" Andre stood. "Yes. I'm Councilman Dale Walker. Sorry for the delay. Seems there was some confusion about your appointment." "No confusion on my end," Andre replied evenly. Dale's mouth twitched, but he didn't respond. "Follow me." The council chamber was small and underwhelming, just a wooden table surrounded by mismatched chairs. Papers cluttered the surface, along with old mugs stained with coffee rings. Andre set his briefcase down and offered his hand, only to have Dale hesitate a moment too long before shaking it. "So, you're the lawyer for this project?" Dale asked, his tone laced with thin skepticism. "I am." "Out of where?" "Boston," Andre replied. Dale let out a low hum, clearly unimpressed. "Boston, huh? What brings you out to a place like Millwood?" Andre smiled politely. "I go where my clients need me." Dale leaned back in his chair, arms folding over his chest. "Well, I'll be honest with you, Mr. Holland. This whole youth center business seems like a waste of resources to me. Fancy buildings won't fix the kinds of problems folks have here." Andre's smile didn't waver, though something in his chest tightened. "I disagree. Councilman communities thrive when you invest in them: jobs, education, and a safe space for young people. These things create change." Dale grunted. "Seems like the kind of thing outsiders say when they think they know better than us." Andre held his gaze. "I'm here to help, not interfere. But I can't do that unless we move forward with the permits." The room grew quiet. The other two council members exchanged brief glances but said nothing. Dale scratched his jaw, clearly deliberating. Finally, he leaned forward, his voice dropping a little. "I'll tell you the truth, Mr. Holland, folks around here don't trust easy. We've had people like you, no offense, come in and promise change, only to pack up and leave when it doesn't work out. If you think you can just walk in here and tell us how to run things, you'll be disappointed." Andre's jaw tensed, but his voice remained steady. "I'm not here to tell you how to run things. I'm here because there's potential for this town. Potential that you're standing in the way of." Dale's eyes darkened. "Watch yourself, son." "Councilman," Andre corrected smoothly. "It's Mr. Holland." Dale stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. "This meeting's over. I'll let you know if we decide to revisit this." Andre remained seated for a long moment, staring back at Dale without blinking. Finally, he stood, calm and measured as ever. "Thank you for your time, Councilman." As Andre exited the building, he felt the weight of eyes on him yet again. He knew exactly what Dale's thinly veiled hostility meant. He wasn't just fighting for a permit. He was fighting against the entrenched belief that someone like him didn't belong here, let alone deserve to make a difference. Outside, the sky was dimming, the sun melting into shades of amber and gray. Andre paused on the steps, the cool air filling his lungs as he suppressed the frustration building in his chest. He'd been here before. He'd heard the same tones, seen the same dismissive looks, but he wasn't leaving. Millwood didn't know it yet, but Andre Holland was a man who didn't back down. Andre Holland strode through Millwood's narrow streets with purposeful steps, his mind churning as he replayed the council meeting. Dale Walker's hostility wasn't unexpected, but it was the implications behind it that gnawed at him. Walker's comment about people like you echoed in his mind like a bitter refrain. Andre's phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out and glanced at the screen. "Mitchell Callahan." Andre answered. "Mitchell. Where are you?" Mitchell's voice was tight, urgent. "You need to come to the youth center site right now." Andre's brow furrowed. "Why, what's going on?" "Just get here. It's bad, man. Real bad." The line clicked dead. Andre's grip tightened around the phone. Without wasting a second, he headed for his rental car, the courthouse fading behind him. The construction site for the proposed youth center was a few blocks from the courthouse, a stretch of undeveloped land littered with old bricks and abandoned equipment. When Andre arrived, he could already see a cluster of people gathered near the edge of the site, their voices low and uneasy. Mitchell stood in the center, his hands on his hips, glaring at a familiar figure. Sheriff Grady. Two other officers stood beside him, one of whom was holding a clipboard, while the other snapped photographs of the ground. "What's going on here?" Andre called as he approached. Mitchell turned sharply, relief flashing across his face. "Andre!" Sheriff Grady spun toward him, a smug smile curling at his lips. "Well, look who decided to show up." Andre stopped a few feet away, his eyes moving from Grady to the officers, and finally to Mitchell. "I asked a question, what's going on?" Grady's smile widened. "Just performing our duty. Seems there's been some concerning discoveries here." "Concerning discoveries?" Andre repeated, his tone icy. The officer with the clipboard stepped forward, holding up a worn Ziploc bag containing what appeared to be a small plastic bundle. "We found this on the property, Sir Drugs." Andre's heart sank. "That's impossible." Grady chuckled, the sound low and full of amusement. "Impossible, I don't think so. See, there have been reports about suspicious activity at this site for weeks. My deputies have been keeping an eye on things." He gestured dramatically to the empty land. "And what do we find? Narcotics buried in the ground right under your youth center." Mitchell stepped forward, his voice raised. "That's bull, and you know it. We've been working this site for weeks. There's no way that was here before." Grady's expression darkened, and he turned toward Mitchell, his voice sharp. "Watch yourself, son. You calling me a liar?" Mitchell's fists clenched at his sides, but Andre stepped between them, his posture straight and calm. "Let's cut through the theatrics. Sheriff, you and I both know this wasn't here yesterday, and it didn't get here on its own." Grady's eyes glinted with thinly veiled malice. "Are you accusing law enforcement of planting evidence?" Andre's voice was dangerously steady. "I'm stating that this smells like a setup." "Big words," Grady said, his tone mocking. "But it won't matter. This here's enough to halt your little project indefinitely, maybe even enough to launch a formal investigation into whoever's involved." He let the insinuation hang in the air, his gaze narrowing. Andre felt his pulse quicken. The message was clear. This was no accident. It was an attack, a deliberate move to discredit the project and implicate him or Mitchell in something they had no part in. "Who filed these reports you mentioned?" Andre demanded. Grady smirked. "That's not information I'm at liberty to share." Mitchell exploded. "You're a damn liar. You—" Andre raised a hand, stopping him. "Mitchell, calm down." Mitchell's chest heaved, his anger barely contained, but he stepped back reluctantly. Andre turned back to Grady, fixing him with a level stare. "This isn't over, Sheriff." Grady shrugged, entirely unbothered. "I'd say it is. For now, my advice? Pack up and leave town before you dig yourself a deeper hole." With that, he turned on his heel, signaling to the other officers. They continued snapping photos of the scene, while Grady walked back to his cruiser, whistling a faint tune, as if the entire encounter had been nothing more than an inconvenience. Andre watched them leave, his hands clenched tightly at his sides. Mitchell stepped up beside him, his voice low and furious. "This is bad. Andre, real bad. They're trying to pin this on us." Andre exhaled sharply, his mind racing. "I know, but we're not letting them get away with it." Mitchell turned to him, skepticism in his eyes. "And what do we do? Go to the council, they're in on it. You saw Walker." Andre's jaw tightened. "Then we fight back." "How?" Andre looked back toward the courthouse in the distance, his eyes narrowing. "We expose them, all of them, starting with whoever planted that evidence." Mitchell hesitated. "They'll come after you harder after both of us." Andre turned toward him, his voice resolute. "Let them. I didn't come here to fold the first time they pushed back." Mitchell stared at him for a moment, then nodded, though the worry remained etched into his face. "Whatever you need, I've got your back." Andre nodded, placing a hand on Mitchell's shoulder. "Then let's get to work." Hours later, Andre sat in the small living room of his rented house, the soft hum of his laptop filling the otherwise silent space. The screen was crowded with documents, emails, permits, and public records he'd spent the last few hours digging through. He needed a connection, a crack in their carefully constructed story. His phone buzzed beside him. He glanced down. Unknown caller. Frowning, he answered. "Andre Holland." A low voice crackled on the other end. "You need to stop poking around, Mr. Holland." Andre's grip tightened on the phone. "Who is this?" Silence. Then, You think you can fix this town? It doesn't want to be fixed, and you're not welcome here. Leave while you can, or we'll make sure you regret it. Click. The line went dead. Andre stared at the phone, his heart pounding. It was a threat, clear and calculated. They were escalating, pushing harder to make him back down. He closed his eyes briefly, inhaling deeply as he set the phone down. The fear was there, faint, but present, like a pulse beneath his skin. But alongside it was something else. Resolve. They wanted him afraid. They wanted him to leave. They didn't know Andre Holland. He turned back to his laptop, his focus sharpening. Somewhere in these records was the leverage he needed. He wouldn't stop until he found it, until the people behind this corruption were brought to light. The clock ticked steadily into the night, but Andre didn't waver. His enemies might have Millwood in their pocket, but Andre had the truth, and that would be enough. The next morning, Andre arrived at the construction site with Mitchell in tow. What they saw made both men freeze in their tracks. The site was swarming with deputies, yellow tape stretched across the perimeter like a scar. Reporters had gathered at the edges, cameras flashing as Sheriff Grady stood at the center of it all, addressing the crowd. "This site has officially been closed pending further investigation," Grady announced. "Evidence of illegal activities has been discovered, and we will be looking closely at all involved parties." The words hit Andre like a blow, but he didn't flinch. He felt Mitchell tense beside him, heard the low murmur of the crowd, but his focus was locked on Grady. The sheriff glanced up, his smug gaze meeting Andre's. Andre took a slow breath, his fists tightening at his sides. They were trying to bury him, bury the youth center, bury everything he'd worked for. But it wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Andre turned to Mitchell, his voice low and steady. "Get the press ready." Mitchell blinked. "For what?" Andre's eyes burned with quiet fury. "For the truth." The reporters swarmed the perimeter of the construction site like a pack of circling vultures, cameras clicking and microphones jabbing toward Sheriff Grady, who stood at the center of the chaos. "This site has officially been deemed a crime scene," Grady repeated, his gravelly voice projecting for the cameras. "We are launching a full investigation into all parties connected to this location." Andre Holland stood just outside the cordon, fists clenched at his sides as the weight of Grady's words sank in. Mitchell hovered nearby, his face flushed with anger and disbelief. "This is insane," Mitchell muttered, his voice low. "They're really going through with this. How the hell are we supposed to fight back?" Andre didn't answer immediately. He kept his eyes locked on Grady, whose smug posture spoke volumes. This wasn't about enforcing the law. This was about destroying everything Andre had built, everything he represented. The youth center had been a beacon of hope for the community, a project meant to lift kids out of troubled circumstances and give them a chance at a better future. For the powers in Millwood, people like Grady and Councilman Walker, that hope was a threat. Andre turned to Mitchell, his voice calm but firm. "Get the press ready. We're not letting this slide." Mitchell frowned. "You want to talk to them? You really think that's a good idea?" "Right now they've got Grady's version of the story," Andre replied. "If we stay silent, that's the only version people are going to hear." Mitchell hesitated, then nodded. "I'll pull them over." As Mitchell moved toward the edge of the crowd, Andre squared his shoulders and stepped toward the yellow tape. The deputies standing guard eyed him warily, but none of them moved to stop him. He could feel their unease, their hesitation. Grady, however, didn't share their discomfort. The sheriff's lips curled into a smirk as Andre approached. "Mr. Holland," he drawled, loud enough for the press to hear. "I'd be careful about getting too close to an active investigation." Andre stopped just short of the tape. "You're making a mistake, Sheriff." Grady chuckled, shaking his head. "No. You made the mistake, son, trying to build a project like this in my town." He took a step closer, dropping his voice. "You really thought you could come here, stir things up, and not face any consequences?" Andre's jaw tightened. "I came here to help this community." Grady's smirk faltered for a split second before he recovered. "Sure you did, just like every other outsider who thinks they know what's best for us?" Andre took a slow breath, forcing himself to remain calm. "You don't speak for this town, Sheriff, and you're not going to scare me off." Grady's eyes darkened, and his voice dropped lower. "You should be scared, Holland. You've got a lot more to lose than you realize." Before Andre could respond, The press caught wind of the confrontation. Microphones swung toward him, and cameras zoomed in as reporters shouted over each other. "Mr. Holland, what's your response to the allegations? Is it true drugs were found at the youth center site? Do you deny any involvement?" Andre turned to face the reporters, his voice cutting through the chaos. "These allegations are baseless, and anyone who knows me or my work understands that this is nothing but a coordinated attempt to shut down a project that's meant to help this community." Grady stepped forward, his face a mask of exaggerated surprise. "Are you accusing law enforcement of misconduct, Mr. Holland?" Andre ignored him, addressing the crowd directly. "I've spent my life fighting for underserved communities, building projects like this one to give people, especially young people, a fighting chance. I won't let anyone tear that down with false accusations and underhanded tactics." Grady snorted, playing to the cameras. "It's convenient to play the victim, but the evidence speaks for itself." "Evidence that you conveniently discovered," Andre shot back, his voice sharp. "This site has been clean for weeks, and you know it." The reporters began murmuring, cameras shifting to capture both men. Grady's face turned a shade darker, but before he could respond, a deputy hurried over, whispering something in his ear. Grady's expression soured instantly. "What is it?" Andre pressed, watching the exchange closely. The deputy hesitated before stepping back, and Grady's tone turned icy. "That's none of your concern." "It looks like it is." Grady ignored him, signaling to his deputies. "Wrap this up," he barked, "and make sure no one steps on this property." He turned back to Andre, his voice a low growl. "I'll be seeing you soon, Holland." Back at the rented house, Andre and Mitchell sat in tense silence. A stack of printed documents lay scattered across the table: permits, contracts, emails, everything they'd collected to legitimize the youth center. Mitchell rubbed a hand over his face. "This isn't enough. Even if we prove we had all the right permits, that doesn't explain away the drugs." Andre sat back in his chair, staring at the papers in front of him. "They planted it, Mitchell, and someone helped them do it." Mitchell sighed. "Yeah, but how do we prove that Grady controls the deputies? Walker controls the council. Who's gonna believe us?" Andre was quiet for a moment before speaking. "We don't need them to believe us right now. We just need to find someone who'll listen." Mitchell raised an eyebrow. "Like who?" Before Andre could answer, his phone buzzed. It was a text message from an unknown number. "You don't know me, but I have information about what happened today. Meet me at the old gas station on Route 17 midnight." Andre frowned, showing the message to Mitchell. "This could be a setup," Mitchell said immediately. "Or it could be a break," Andre replied. "You're seriously thinking about going?" Andre nodded. "If there's even a chance this person knows something, I need to hear them out." Mitchell exhaled sharply, shaking his head. "Fine. But I'm coming with you." At midnight, the old gas station on Route 17 was pitch dark, the flickering neon sign long dead and forgotten. Andre's car rolled to a stop on the gravel, headlights cutting through the darkness. Mitchell sat in the passenger seat, eyes scanning the area. "This is creepy as hell," Mitchell muttered. Andre said nothing. He stepped out of the car, his breath clouding in the cool night air. A lone figure stood near the gas pumps, face obscured by a hood. Andre approached cautiously, stopping a few feet away. "You the one who sent the message?" The figure nodded and spoke in a low voice. "I work for the county records office. I saw something I wasn't supposed to." "What?" Andre pressed. The figure hesitated, then pulled a flash drive from their pocket, holding it out. "Everything you need is on here: files, records, communications between Grady and Walker." Andre took the flash drive, his heart pounding. "Why are you giving this to me?" "Because I'm tired of watching this town get torn apart," the figure replied. "But you need to be careful. They're not done with you yet." Before Andre could ask anything else, the figure turned and disappeared into the night. Mitchell approached quickly. "What was that about?" Andre held up the flash drive, his voice steady. "Proof." Mitchell's eyes widened. "You think this is legit?" "There's only one way to find out." Andre turned back toward the car, his resolve hardening. The stakes had never been higher, and the battle was far from over. But now, finally, he had something to fight with. As they pulled away from the gas station, Andre couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning. The walls were closing in, but he was ready to push back. Andre Holland sat at the edge of the conference room table, the flash drive clutched in his hand. The early morning light streamed through the blinds, casting harsh shadows that seemed to underscore the weight of what he was about to do. Mitchell paced nervously across the room, his agitation palpable. "We've got enough on that drive to blow this whole thing wide open," Mitchell said, his voice low but urgent. Emails, texts, records of bribes. Grady and Walker orchestrated the whole thing. The planted drugs, the shutdown, everything. We take this to the press, the mayor's office, whoever, and they're done. Andre's gaze remained fixed on the drive. If we go public without warning, they'll spin it. Discredit us, say we forged the evidence. Mitchell stopped pacing. "So what do you want to do, sit on it?" Andre shook his head. "No, I'm going to confront Grady myself. I want him to know he doesn't control the narrative anymore." Mitchell stared at him. "Are you out of your damn mind? That man hates you, Andre? He's dangerous." "Let him be dangerous," Andre replied, his voice steady but cold. "He's built his entire career on intimidation. If we don't confront him head on, he'll just bury this and come at us harder." Mitchell exhaled sharply, shaking his head. "You're playing with fire, man." Andre pushed off the table and grabbed his coat. "Sometimes you have to let it burn to rebuild something better." The air was heavy with humidity as Andre walked through the doors of the Millwood Sheriff's office. The small lobby felt quieter than usual, though a couple of deputies looked up from behind the front desk, exchanging nervous glances as Andre approached. "I'm here to see Sheriff Grady," Andre said, his tone leaving no room for debate. The deputy hesitated. "Is he expecting you?" Andre stared him down. "Tell him it's urgent." The deputy relented, picking up the phone and muttering something into the receiver. Moments later, he nodded toward the hallway. "Go on back." Andre walked down the narrow corridor, his footsteps echoing. When he reached the door marked Sheriff D. Grady, he didn't bother knocking. He pushed it open and stepped inside. Grady looked up from his desk, a thin smirk spreading across his face. "Well, look who's decided to pay me a visit." Andre shut the door behind him, the click loud in the otherwise silent room. "We need to talk, Sheriff." Grady leaned back in his chair, arms folding over his chest. "You've got some nerve walking in here after everything that's happened." Andre took a step forward, holding up the flash drive. "I've got proof, Grady, proof that you and Walker set me up, emails, records, everything." Grady's smirk faltered for the briefest moment before he schooled his expression back into place. "You think you can walk in here, wave around some evidence, and scare me? You don't know how things work in this town, Holland." "I know exactly how things work," Andre shot back. "You've spent years building a system where you can do whatever you want. Threaten people, frame them, ruin lives, and no one stops you because they're too afraid to stand up to you." Grady's expression darkened. "Careful, you're making some dangerous accusations." Andre stepped closer, his voice low but steady. "They're not accusations, Sheriff. They're facts. And the moment I walk out of here, this goes to the press, the state authorities, everyone who needs to see it." For the first time, a crack appeared in Grady's veneer. He rose from his chair slowly, his towering frame casting a long shadow. "You think you're untouchable, don't you? You think because you've got some money and a name, you can come into my town and challenge me?" Andre didn't flinch. "This isn't your town, Grady. It belongs to the people you've been keeping down. I'm here to make sure they get it back." Grady's face twisted into a sneer. "You don't get it. No one's going to believe you. Not the council, not the courts. You're just another outsider who doesn't know when to quit." Andre held up the flash drive again, his tone razor sharp. "I have the truth on my side, and that's all I need." Grady took a step closer, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "The truth doesn't matter when you control the story." "You think you're smarter than me, Holland? You think you're going to ruin everything I've built?" Andre stared him down, unblinking. "I'm not ruining anything. You did that yourself, I'm just exposing it." For a moment, the room was silent, the air crackling with tension. Grady's breathing grew heavier, his fists clenching at his sides as if he were on the edge of losing control. Then, without warning, he lunged. Grady's massive hands grabbed Andre's shirt, shoving him hard against the wall. The impact knocked the breath from Andre's lungs, but he didn't fight back. He didn't need to. "Get off me!" Andre growled, his voice steady even as Grady's face loomed inches from his own. Grady's lips curled back into a snarl. "I can bury you, Holland. No one will care. No one will even ask questions." A sharp knock echoed from the door. "Sheriff?" Grady froze. The deputy's voice was muffled through the door, but it broke through the moment like a gunshot. Grady released his grip, stepping back and straightening his uniform with shaky hands. Andre stayed where he was, his chest rising and falling as he held Grady's glare. "Your days of bullying this town are over," Andre said, his voice calm despite the fire in his eyes. "You can't stop what's coming." Grady's face turned a deep red, his jaw twitching with barely contained fury. "Get out of my office." Andre adjusted his collar, turning toward the door. Just before he stepped out, he glanced back over his shoulder. "I'll see you soon, Sheriff." Back outside, the morning sun hit Andre's face, a stark contrast to the darkness he'd just walked out of. Mitchell was waiting by the car, his expression tense as Andre approached. "How'd it go?" Mitchell asked. Andre handed him the flash drive, his jaw tight. "Grady knows we're coming for him." "And?" Andre met Mitchell's gaze, determination etched into every line of his face. "He's scared." Mitchell exhaled slowly, glancing toward the sheriff's office. "So what now?" Andre looked out at the small town stretched before him, its streets quiet and unassuming. The weight of what was at stake pressed down on his shoulders, but his resolve held firm. "Now we finish this," Andre said. "We take it public, we let the world see who Grady really is." As they climbed into the car and pulled away, Andre could feel the tide turning. Grady had shown his hand, and for the first time, Andre knew the sheriff was running scared. The fight wasn't over, but the tables had turned. The town hall parking lot was already packed when Andre pulled up. Word had spread like wildfire. People gathered in clusters on the lawn, murmuring anxiously, their faces a mix of anticipation and tension. Local news vans parked at awkward angles, antennas raised high to catch the signal. Andre stepped out of the car, his suit crisp and purposeful, though the weight of the moment sat heavy on his shoulders. Mitchell met him at the edge of the lot, clutching his phone. "You sure about this, man?" he asked, glancing nervously at the building. Andre nodded, his jaw set. "Grady's hiding in plain sight. The only way to beat him is to pull the curtain back in front of everyone." Mitchell exhaled. "Well, it's all set up. The press is inside, half the town's here, and the council's been forced to let you speak. Grady's gonna come unglued when he sees you." "Let him," Andre replied quietly. "This ends today." Together, they walked toward the double doors, the crowd parting as Andre passed. Whispers followed him, some hopeful, others skeptical. But he kept his focus forward. He wasn't just fighting for himself anymore. Inside, the council chamber was standing room only. Townspeople filled the pews, while the council members sat stiffly at the raised table. Sheriff Grady stood off to the side, his arms crossed over his chest. His face twisted into a mocking smirk as his gaze locked onto Andre. "Well, look who decided to join us," Grady said loudly, his voice carrying over the buzz of the crowd. "The town's favorite troublemaker." A few uneasy chuckles rippled through the room, but Andre ignored them. He walked calmly to the podium in front of the council. Behind him, reporters shuffled to position cameras, flashes blinking like a storm. One of the councilmen, Mr. Hardwick, leaned forward. "Mr. Holland, we've been informed you have something urgent to share." Andre's voice was clear and steady, cutting through the noise. "Yes, I do." He turned slightly, scanning the crowd before locking eyes with Grady. "What I have to share concerns Sheriff Grady and his abuse of power." The murmurs grew louder. Grady's smirk didn't waver, but his jaw tightened. "This is outrageous," Grady interrupted, stepping forward. "You're out of line." Andre ignored him, pulling a small stack of papers from his briefcase and holding them up. "For weeks, I've been gathering evidence. What you're about to see shows a clear pattern of corruption, manipulation, and sabotage at the hands of Sheriff Grady. He and his deputies have planted false evidence, orchestrated illegal shutdowns, and threatened members of this community into silence, and all of it has been covered up under his so-called authority." "Lies," Grady snapped, stepping toward the podium now. "This man is lying. This is just another attempt to stir up trouble." Andre turned toward him sharply. You want to call me a liar, Sheriff? Then explain this. He held up a flash drive. Inside this drive are emails, messages, and financial records that prove exactly what I'm saying. Walker, your deputy, gave me the last piece of the puzzle when he realized just how deep this goes. The room gasped. Grady's face paled for the first time. Walker wouldn't. He did, Andre cut him off. And it's all here, every single thing you thought you buried. Grady's mask began to crack. The council chamber buzzed louder now, people exchanging frantic whispers as the sheriff visibly squirmed. This is a farce, Grady barked. This man has been on a personal crusade since he came here. None of this holds water. Andre's expression didn't falter. Then let's find out. I'll let the state investigators determine what's true and what's not. You see, Sheriff, I've already sent copies of this evidence to the Attorney General's office and a few major news outlets. This isn't just about what you say anymore. Grady's eyes burned with fury. His voice dropped to a dangerous whisper as he stepped closer to Andre. You don't know what you've done. Andre squared his shoulders. I know exactly what I've done. I've stopped you. Suddenly, Grady lunged. The crowd gasped as the sheriff grabbed Andre's jacket and shoved him backward. The flash of cameras exploded, reporters scrambling to capture every second of the chaos. Mitchell rushed forward, shouting, but Andre held up his hand to stop him. Go ahead, Andre said, his voice carrying through the stunned silence. Show them who you really are. Grady's chest heaved, his grip loosening as he realized what he'd done. The council members stared in shock. People in the audience murmured, some standing now, their disbelief turning to realization. You're done, Andre said quietly. Grady let go of him, stumbling back as if the weight of the room was finally crushing him. For the first time, he looked afraid. The sheriff turned toward the council, desperation in his voice. Are you going to let him ruin this town with his lies? Councilman Hardwick cleared his throat, struggling to regain control of the room. Sheriff Grady, he said, his voice wavering, this matter will be investigated if what Mr. Holland says is true. He trailed off, but the implication hung heavy in the air. Grady's shoulders slumped, his face red with humiliation and anger. He glared at Andre, his voice barely audible as he hissed, You'll regret this. Andre met his gaze unflinchingly. No, you will. The room erupted into noise as Grady stormed out, shoving through the crowd like a cornered animal. Cameras followed him, reporters shouting questions, but the sheriff offered no answers. Andre turned back to the council. The truth always comes out, gentlemen, whether you want it to or not. Hardwick nodded slowly. We'll see to it that this is investigated thoroughly. Andre stepped away from the podium, the energy in the room now crackling with a mix of anger, relief, and disbelief. Mitchell appeared at his side, his face a mixture of awe and exhaustion. You really did it, Mitchell said quietly. Not yet, Andre replied, glancing toward the exit where Grady had disappeared. But it's a start. As they walked out of the council chamber into the afternoon light, the crowd outside had grown larger. Reporters swarmed them, cameras flashing, microphones shoved into their faces. Mr. Holland, what's next for the investigation? Is Sheriff Grady going to be arrested? How far does this corruption go? Andre didn't stop walking. The truth's out now. The rest will take care of itself. Mitchell grinned as they reached the car. I hope Grady enjoyed his last day in charge. Andre looked back at the town hall, where people were still pouring out, their faces alive with shock and questions. Change was coming, he could feel it, but this wasn't over yet. He opened the car door and paused. He's not the last one we'll have to deal with, Mitch. There's a whole system behind him, and it's going to fight back. Mitchell slid into the driver's seat, his smile fading. You ready for that? Andre met his gaze. I've been ready. As they drove away, the sounds of the town hall faded behind them, but the fight was far from over. The fallout was swift. By the next morning, Sheriff Grady's face was plastered across every news station and headline. Local sheriff under investigation for corruption and misconduct scrolled across the bottom of TV screens. Footage of him storming out of the council chamber, anger etched into every line of his face, played on a loop. Reporters camped outside his house, shouting questions he refused to answer. The Attorney General's office confirmed they were launching a formal investigation. Internal Affairs followed suit. Grady's allies, who had once operated comfortably under his shadow, were now scattering like rats from a sinking ship. Deputies resigned overnight. Others, like Walker, came forward to share everything they knew, eager to save themselves from the blowback. For the first time in years, the iron grip Grady had held over Millbrook was breaking. Andre watched it all unfold with a quiet sense of victory. Sitting in his modest kitchen, sipping black coffee as the sun rose, he finally felt the weight begin to lift. Mitchell sat across from him, scrolling through his phone. "You see this?" he said, holding up an article. "Grady's already being called the face of small-town corruption. They're saying it could open investigations across the state." Andre nodded. "Good. It's bigger than just him. The whole system needs to be held accountable." Mitchell studied him for a moment. "You look different." "Different how?" Andre asked, a small smile playing at his lips. "Lighter, like you're breathing again for the first time." Andre set his mug down, his smile fading slightly. "This was never just about Grady. I didn't come back here for revenge. I came back to change things for my father. For everyone in this town who's been overlooked, silenced, or pushed out." Mitchell leaned back, grinning. "Well, you did it. At least the first part. Everyone's talking about you, man. The council looks like they're ready to name you a hero." "I don't need to be anyone's hero," Andre replied firmly. "I just need them to listen, to realize they can't turn a blind eye anymore." The days that followed were a blur of press conferences, interviews, and statements. Andre stood in front of cameras, calm and composed, as reporters bombarded him with questions. He laid out the facts, piece by piece, refusing to embellish the truth. His father's name was cleared in the process, a small but significant victory that brought tears to Andre's eyes the night he saw the official apology released by the council. Sheriff Grady was stripped of his badge. The formal charges came soon after: abuse of power, falsification of evidence, and obstruction of justice. For the townspeople, it was a reckoning long overdue. People who had feared speaking out now shared their stories. Former deputies admitted how Grady had coerced them into silence, manipulating them with threats of retaliation. Parents whose children had been targeted under his reign came forward with tearful accounts of harassment. It wasn't just Grady's downfall, it was the unraveling of an entire system. The town began to heal, little by little. New leaders stepped into roles that had once been locked behind closed doors. Reform committees were formed, and community leaders started discussions on building trust between law enforcement and the people. It wasn't perfect, real change would take time, but Andre could see the first cracks of progress. On a quiet afternoon, Andre returned to the courthouse steps, the place where it had all started. It felt different now, less heavy, more open. As he stood there, hands in his pockets, Sarah approached. She smiled warmly, holding out a file. "Thought you'd want to see this." Andre flipped it open. The first page read, "Town Council announces new Community Oversight Board." He looked up at her. "This is happening?" Sarah nodded. "It's happening. They're making you an honorary member, said you're the reason this board even exists." Andre chuckled, shaking his head. "I'm just a guy who refused to back down." "Maybe," Sarah said, tilting her head, "but you gave people courage, Andre. When they saw you stand up to Grady, they realized they didn't have to be afraid anymore." Andre took a deep breath, glancing back at the courthouse. This isn't over. There are still people out there like him, systems that keep them in power. Sarah smiled knowingly. "That's why we need people like you to keep fighting." Later that evening, Andre stood on the small hill overlooking his family's property, the sun setting behind the trees. It had been weeks since Grady's arrest, and for the first time, he let himself pause, just to feel the moment. His father's old pickup sat in the driveway, exactly where it had been the day Andre left Millbrook all those years ago. For so long, that truck had been a symbol of his father's life. A quiet, hard-working man, who had been crushed under the weight of an unjust system. Andre's mother stepped out onto the porch, waving him down. "You coming in, baby?" "Yeah," he called back, but he didn't move yet. Instead, he looked at the horizon, the orange and pink sky stretching out above the town. Millbrook still had scars, but now it had a chance to heal. For years, this place had driven him away, taught him that no matter how hard you fought, some battles couldn't be won. But now, he realized something else. Change wasn't about winning one fight, it was about showing up, again and again, until the tide turned. "Ready for what comes next?" Mitchell's voice called from behind him. Andre turned, smiling faintly. Always. The town newspaper would later describe Andre as the man who stood up when no one else would. But he didn't see it that way. He wasn't a hero. He was a man who chose not to look away. And if others followed his example, maybe one day Millbrook would be a place where no one had to fight just to be seen. For now, Andre was content to rest. Just for a moment. Change had begun, and he'd made sure it wouldn't stop with him. The evening sun bathed Millbrook in a soft golden glow as Andre sat on the porch of his family's house, a steaming mug of tea in his hands. The hum of crickets and the distant rustle of leaves filled the silence. For the first time in years, he felt still, like a man who had finally put down a burden he didn't realize he'd been carrying. His father's old chair sat beside him, empty but ever-present, a reminder of the quiet strength he had inherited. Andre found himself reflecting on his journey. Not just the weeks of exposing Grady and dismantling the corruption that had strangled the town, but the years leading up to it. Years of working his way up, proving himself to those who refused to see him, fighting battles both visible and invisible. Millbrook had been his crucible, a place where he had been forced to confront not just others' prejudices, but his own doubts. Yet standing against Grady, taking on a system that seemed immovable, had changed him. He had always been resilient, but now he knew the power of persistence, of pushing forward, even when the path was obscured. "Sometimes change doesn't come like a flood," Andre murmured softly, as though speaking to his father. "Sometimes it's just a stream, carving the earth bit by bit." The town had changed, though not overnight. Grady's arrest sent ripples through Millbrook, and the conversation it sparked was one that could no longer be ignored. For the first time, the people who had been silenced were stepping forward, telling their stories of discrimination, harassment, and abuse of power. Andre had seen it firsthand. At a town hall meeting weeks after Grady's removal, the room was full, more people than he'd ever seen gathered together for a cause. Parents shared tearful accounts of their children being unfairly profiled. Small business owners recounted threats they had received if they didn't comply with Grady's demands. People who had once been afraid were now finding their voices. It wasn't easy. Change never was. There were skeptics, those who muttered about things going too far or dismissed the accusations as exaggerations. Some still clung to the comfort of silence, unwilling to acknowledge what had been happening under their noses. But Andre saw progress in every raised hand, every voice that refused to tremble. In time, the Community Oversight Board was formed, a panel of residents tasked with holding local leadership accountable. It wasn't a perfect solution, but it was a start. Andre had accepted the invitation to serve as a founding member, though he had no desire to wield authority. His goal was to ensure that no one else had to fight alone, the way his father had, the way so many others had. "This isn't about revenge," Andre told the crowd at the board's inaugural meeting. "It's about accountability. It's about building a system that works for everyone, one where no one feels invisible." His words resonated beyond Millbrook. The story spread, picked up by news outlets and advocacy groups. Andre became a symbol of resilience, though he bristled at the label. He wasn't looking for praise or recognition. If anything, he wanted the focus to remain on the town, on the people who had endured so much and still found the courage to demand better. "Your story gives people hope," Sarah told him one afternoon, as they stood on the courthouse steps. "You stood up when it would have been easier to walk away, and because of that, people see what's possible." Andre shook his head, his voice quiet. "Hope doesn't come from me. It comes from all of us, refusing to accept the way things are. I'm just one person." "Sometimes one person is all it takes," she replied, her smile soft. Andre had grown, though not in ways that were immediately visible. His fight with Grady had been personal, yes, but it had also opened his eyes to the broader struggles facing towns just like Millbrook. It wasn't just about one corrupt sheriff or one broken system. It was about a pattern, a cycle that repeated itself in places where power went unchecked and voices were stifled. There were more battles ahead. Andre knew that racism, corruption, and systemic failures didn't disappear with the removal of one bad actor. They were roots buried deep in the ground, and cutting off a branch didn't remove the tree. But Millbrook had shown him that roots could be loosened, the ground could be tilled, change could begin. And that was enough. For now. A month after Grady's downfall, Andre found himself back in his father's workshop. Dust hung in the air, golden beams of sunlight cutting through the small window. Tools lined the walls, exactly where his father had left them. Andre ran a hand over the worn workbench, feeling the grooves and scratches carved by years of hard labor. It struck him then how much his father had endured. The quiet sacrifices, the moments of injustice he had swallowed because he didn't have the power to fight back. "But you made me strong," Andre whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "And I'll keep going for you." In that moment, Andre realized his fight wasn't just about justice, it was about legacy. His father had spent his life building things with his hands. Piece by piece, Andre would do the same, but his tools were different. Words, action, and perseverance would be his hammer and nails. He wouldn't stop until the next generation of black boys and girls in Millbrook, and towns like it, could walk through life without having to fight for every step. As the evening sun dipped below the horizon, Andre stood on the hill overlooking his family's property, his silhouette outlined against the sky. Millbrook stretched out below him, the town quieter now, as if exhaling after a long-held breath. The road ahead was long. There would be setbacks, new Grady-like figures might emerge, and the fight for justice would need to be waged again and again. But Andre wasn't afraid. He had seen what resilience could do. He thought of his father, of Sarah, of Mitchell, and everyone who had stepped up when the moment called for it. Together, they had chipped away at something that seemed unshakable, and together, they would keep going. The story wasn't over, it was just beginning. Andre turned back toward the house, a determined smile on his face. Tomorrow, there would be more work to do, and he was ready for it. For his father. For Millbrook. For everyone still waiting to be heard. Reflection. This story isn't just about Andre. It's about the fight against systemic injustice that countless people face every day. It's about how one person's courage can inspire an entire community to stand up and demand change. Andre's journey shows us that progress is possible, even when the odds feel insurmountable. Change takes time, effort, and sacrifice. It requires persistence, resilience, and the willingness to speak truth to power. But as Andre proved, it's worth it. Because every step forward, no matter how small, brings us closer to a world where justice, fairness, and equality aren't ideals but realities. And that's a fight worth showing up for.